IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Megha Pardhi. I'm a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution's China Studies Group. In today's episode, I'm exploring China's concept of democracy. In the past few months, China has tried to define and project itself as a democracy as opposed to the conception of Chinese political system as that of an authoritarian nature. These attempts seem to be not just to highlight China's democratic system, but also to highlight how different it is from Western conception of democracy. For example, just ahead of Joe Biden's summit of democracies in December 2021, China released a series of documents exploring their own version of what they think as their conception of Chinese style of democracy. Similarly, on December 4, State Council of Information Office released a white paper titled China, the Democracy That Works. And it kind of indicates that China wants to highlight that theirs is a style of democracy that actually works as opposed to the other variants. So to discuss more on this topic, we have today with us Dr. Sungmin Cho. Dr. Cho joined Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in August 2018. His area of research interest covers China-Korean Peninsula relations, North Korea's nuclear program, Korean unification, and the U.S. alliance in East Asia. He also closely follows domestic politics of China and North Korea. Before joining Asia-Pacific Center for Security, Dr. Cho was lecturer for the Asian Studies program at Georgetown University from 2016 to 18, where he taught domestic politics of China and politics of nuclear weapons in East Asia. He has also published articles on politics and security affairs in various peer-reviewed journals, including World Politics, the China Journal, Asian Security, and the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, among many others. And his commentaries have also appeared in Foreign Affairs, War on the Rocks, Diplomat, and other publications. So I welcome Dr. Cho.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's kind of, start from the beginning. How would you like to define China's political system or Chinese style of democracy? Even if can we even call it a democracy as it's claimed by Beijing?
Yes. So one way to explain, define the Chinese democracy is that, so in the West, democracy is defined as a political system that is run, that the government consists of people elected by the people, and then thereby the government is working for the people. So it is the politics consists of the people, by the people, and for the people. In China, democracy is defined as the government working for the people and for the people and for the people. So there is a emphasis on the triple four, that the government is working for the people. So whether the government officials are elected by the people, consist of the people elected by the people, are secondary considerations. The most important aspect of the democracy should be that the government is actually serving the best possible interest of the vast majority of the people. So, and then the Chinese Communist Party, they claim that they delegate the interest of the vast majority of the people, and then they promise, and then they actually serve for the interest of the people. And then from that definition, they criticize the Western democracy. Although the leaders are elected through democratic elections, and then that's how they form the government, but there is no guarantee that the politicians are actually working really for the vast majority of the people. Chinese scholars and theorists, they criticize that Western democracy politicians, they only serve the narrow interest of the interest groups, like a major corporations or some associations of the interest groups. So the politicians do not really represent the vast majority of people's interest, whereas in Chinese political system, the party really work for the people. And then the latest example for the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda system is the consequence of COVID. So from the Johns Hopkins University gathered data about the death from the COVID-19. Last week, when I checked, the US had a death toll of some 900,000 people who died from COVID-19, whereas China only had 9,000. So there is about 100 times difference. And given the difference in population size, that means the US lost 400 times more than China lost its people from the COVID-19. And then that's the example of how political system works in both countries. In China, although there is no democratic election, but the consequence of the political system can be really contrasted with the example of this COVID-19 related death. American system, although they say it is the most developed democracy, but it failed to prevent the death of that massive number of COVID deaths. And also even the democratic election was damaged when there was a mob attack on the US Congress after the last presidential election in January 2021. There was very chaotic and messy procedure of democratic election, whereas in China, the election to select the leadership of the party, although it is the election within the party, but still it is much more orderly. So to summarize, for China, especially for the Chinese Communist Party, democracy is defined as to what extent the government is really working for the people, and then it is a result-oriented system rather than procedure-oriented about electing the leaders.
Okay, so I can say that we're in liberal democracy or a Western liberal democracy where procedures are emphasized like elections and rule of law. In Chinese-style democracy, procedure is not important. The outcomes are more, correct?
Yes. Chinese theorists, Communist Party theorists, they do emphasize the procedure, but they emphasize the procedure should be really tailored to serve the consequence, the result. Procedure itself is not really important as much as election is important in defining democracy in the West.
I think that is a very interesting fact. I was also trying to read upon how can I describe this so-called democratic system. Okay, so just before that, can we technically call it a democratic system?
Well, it is really can we agree about the definition of Chinese-style democracy in that way? Maybe North Koreans agree, but in the West and then in many places, it is very hard to agree because the essence of democracy is election. Mm-hmm. So the Chinese Communist Party argue that they really try hard to serve the interest of the people from their heart. So, and many people would argue that, well, we cannot really believe you that you are actually really trying to serve the people, even sacrificing your own interest. And then we can also continue to criticize where Chinese politicians are no different from the politicians in the West who are selfish and then who just pursue their own interest at the expense of the public goods. But for the sake of discussion, let's try to believe that the Chinese leaders, they are really sincere to serve the interest of the people. But still the problem is that they can make mistake unless they are questioned and criticized by the other people. So the Chinese Communist Party, they claim that they cannot be wrong. If they make a mistake, then they can correct that. And then they point that the history of the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese modern history, there were many mistakes like Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, and maybe the Shanghai lockdown now. Those are the policy failures. But Chinese Communist Party, they argue that we can correct our own mistakes. But the problem is that those mistakes are always corrected after so many sacrifices of Chinese people. So many Chinese citizens, they died during the Great Leap War period, Cultural Revolution, and maybe similar thing is ongoing in Shanghai lockdown and many places. So the most effective way to monitor the policymakers is by the freedom of speech or by allowing the opposition party. But and then to do that, there should be an election as well. People should have a right to replace their leaders if they see the mistakes of the policymakers, which also give incentives for the policymakers to make their best efforts. So without the mechanism, there is no way to monitor and correct the policymakers' mistakes. So in that way, even if we believe that Chinese leaders are sincere in their intent, but it may end up being inefficient compared to democratic system.
Yeah, this reminds me of one of the essence of white paper which China recently released, that when they say that we don't duplicate Western model of democracy, but we have our own system of democracy. So yeah, and also the three kind of important part: the party leadership and the people running the country, and of course what they believe is their law-based governance. So I think I would not categorize it as a democracy, like full-fledged democracy per se, but maybe an authoritarian flavor of democracy, maybe, perhaps.
Well, Chinese scholars claim that consultative or rule-based democracy or democracy under the party's leadership, they will never say the word dictatorship. So clearly, within Chinese discourse, Chinese political system is defined as a democracy in its own way. And it is true to a certain extent, there exists some competition for political power because there is a village election and also intra-party election. If you want to get promoted, then you have to go through a certain level of election within the party, although it is not election among the competition among the multi-party system. So there is an election, and then through the 1990s and until mid-2010, until Xi Jinping took power, there was a great progress in liberalization policies. When I say liberalization policy, there was more and more democratic institutions like public hearing, that government officials, they hold town hall meeting to invite local residents to hear feedback about their policies. And also there was a spread of the village elections. So the rural people living in the countryside, they can vote to elect their leaders, direct voting. And also there was a legal reform. So there was a lot of political reform that gives more opportunity for Chinese people to express their opinions about the policy. So the rule was that as long as you don't argue to overthrow the party and then democratize the system to multi-party system or separation of power, then you are okay to criticize the policy. This approach has two benefits for the party. First, the party can really hear what people complains, and then they can also gather better ideas from the people about how to improve the policy. So that if the policy succeeds, then the people support the party even more. So the party has interest in hearing people's opinion. And second, by doing so, the party can create perception that they are really hearing people's opinion, like a democratic country. So there was that progress, and then people appreciate that. Multiple survey shows that Chinese people think that their country is becoming more and more democratic. So from our perspective, outsider's perspective, China is far from the definition, the standard of Western liberal democracy. But by the standard of Chinese own people, they compare today's China to the China in the past. And then China made a lot of progress in the governance system and then all the channels between the society and the party. So Chinese people, they think that the country becomes increasingly democratic. So that works well, that strategy works well. But the problem is that as people think that their country becomes more democratic and they see the evidence, they start to think that maybe we should we should be able to elect our supreme leader someday. That kind of idea spreads among the intellectuals, and then we form a faction within the party. And then that starts to threaten the supreme leaders of Communist Party. So Xi Jinping gathered support from the politicians within the party that, well, our liberalization policy went too far. It works to legitimize our ruling, but it went too far that people start to question the power succession procedure at the top level of the leadership. So that's how the party started to reverse the liberalization policy and introducing more repressive policies back in the system.
So it's interesting that you mentioned, Xi Jinping's preference for, or maybe Xi Jinping highlighting that, we probably went too far. So coming back to those two white papers which I talked about in intro. So these two papers, plus there has been a lot of statements by China's foreign secretaries and leaders, either taunting or criticizing West for their attempts, and also projecting that China indeed is a working democratic system. So, do you think that this trend to project China as democracy is this a new trend, or is this just an attempt to search for legitimacy as a government?
So the timing of the publication coincided with the U.S. Democracy Conference, Democracy Summit. So it is the Chinese Communist Party, CCP's strategy to strengthen its own legitimacy for the domestic audience as well as international audience in the global south. I mean, in Africa, Latin America, or in many other developing countries, there are still many people who admire so-called the China model because it shows that authoritarianism government can also succeed in economic development and maintain social order, and then even gather popular support for the authoritarian regime. So at the end of the Cold War, there was this argument about the end of history. So authoritarian regimes, they feel very insecure about this historical trend of democratization. Like as we have seen color revolution in Eastern and Central Europe, and also Arab Spring in 2011. So many authoritarian leaders, they felt insecure that sooner or later they will lose power because of this global democratization wave. But China shows a counterexample against that wave. It not only survived very successfully, it even became the second largest economy. It looks perfectly controlled the society, and even better, Chinese people support and like the Communist Party leaders until certain point, and especially not these days because of what's going on in Shanghai and then many other places with the COVID lockdown. But until a certain point, there was a growing support of the people about the party. So the Chinese Communist Party leaders currently, I think they have confidence about their narrative about Chinese democracy theory, and then it can be a good sell, not only for Chinese people, but also for the people and the leaders in developing countries and non-democracies. So they put out this idea at the right time when the US gathered a democracy summit. But this idea has been there. It has been developed for a long time from mid-1990s. The problem is that, so the theory is, it makes sense within China, but after Xi Jinping took power, Xi Jinping's policies become more illiberal and repressive. So there is even a growing gap between the theory of Chinese democracy and then the reality of Xi Jinping's repressive policies. So the widening gap is something that the party leaders are struggling to justify, and also the intellectuals, they try to criticize.
Interesting. So with this, we'll take a little break. We'll meet you soon after.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On IVM Like, Snehal, Antriksh and Abbas give us a Star Wars special. Tune in if you'd like the Force to be with you. On Cyrus Says is Cock and Bull. Cyrus is joined by Shreya, Sriram and Antriksh. They discuss the heat wave and electricity outages due to the coal shortage in India. On The Longest Constitution, Priya looks into constitutional provisions that govern an MP or MLA's accountability. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth sheds light on the creator economy and how influencers make money. And on Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav links taboo foods, Hindu epics, and dharma in an interesting tale. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're following this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth is one of our biggest, most helpful things you can do for us. We'd really appreciate that. And also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. Go check out ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. You get a list of all of our YouTube channels there. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and the advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It's at ivmpodcast.com/survey. This really helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors for this week, SBI Life Insurance, India Water Portal, and Jupiter, a digital banking app.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. I'm Megha Pardhi, and today we have with us Dr. Sungmin Cho to discuss China's conception of democracy and different aspects of this topic. So before the break, we tried to locate where exactly China's political system lies, or can we even call it democracy? Then we tried to go into reasons, why is it so, and trends, and some of the concerns of Chinese leaders behind this political system. So before the break, we talked about that there are some, concerns, and also China, other countries, for example, try to project China's style of democracy. But I do have this question: when China tries to define itself as a democratic country, do you also think that somewhere Quad being portrayed as a group of democracies is also factored in this the recent posturing or recent emphasis that we have our own brand of democracy? I mean, you kind of call us that we are not a democracy, there's something like that. What I mean is, so I feel like this recent attempts to like publishing paper and repeatedly mentioning that we have our own style of democracy, we don't need to borrow, kind of sends a message that we are also a democracy, like not unlike what Western commentators would like us to say, like us to portray as an authoritarian system. So is this, the Quad grouping, and Quad groupings, informal nature that we are a grouping of democracies, does this posturing relate to that, or is that also a factor in this new trend in China?
Certainly, democracy is a big piece of Quad. It is one of the common grounds that the Quad countries have. They have a shared value, which is not really consistent with the values that China emphasizes. So if the purpose of the Quad is to counter China's growing influence, then the democratic values that shared by Quad can be really a factor that the Quad countries like to emphasize. But then again, I see that the Quad emphasis by far have been more on technological cooperation, climate change, or public health. There is some discussion about military cooperation, and then they did exercise together several times, but they tried to tone down that the military element of the Quad. I think the intent is to elevate the direction of Quad even higher than just countering China. Just through cooperation, the four countries, they aim to achieve a higher goal on technological cooperation or climate change. In the process, because they have a different perspective, China would feel circled and then contained by these Quad countries. There is that effect. But I think the four countries aim higher. So in that sense, democratic values can play a role. But I don't think that's really a big motivation for now. But I think they will do someday.
Okay. So In the white paper, which I earlier mentioned, and in official statements also, Beijing has criticized attempts to define how others, and also we have mentioned this in our discussion before, that others are how they define a concept of democracy. And for example, as I mentioned, that there is a line in white paper that China did not duplicate Western models of democracy, but created its own. Yet China has engaged with this other countries over multiple times. I also remember that one of your papers you have investigated why non-democracies like China would engage with Western democracies. So can you shed some light on this topic?
Yes. So you're asking about my research on Western democracy.
Yeah.
So that's my research for my PhD dissertation that I completed in 2018. When I researched the relationship between China and the Western countries, I found very interesting trend that so Western countries, notably the United States, they want to promote democracy globally. They run many programs to support democracy process of the other countries, and China is apparently one of the biggest target for democratization promotion programs. And then we assume that China as a non-democracy would not accept that supports from the Western countries for democratization. But I found that compared to Russia, Saudi Arabia, or not to mention North Korea, China was very opening. China was very cooperative to these Western democracy promotion programs between mid 1990s and then all until mid 2010s, until Xi Jinping took power. So why the Chinese government as a non-democracy was willing to open and cooperate with these Western organizations to promote rule of law or village election, administrative reform, and civil society in China. So my finding was that even before the Western countries tried to promote democracy, Chinese Communist Party, they started their own governance reform. Like I explained before, following the definition of Chinese-style democracy, although there is no political reform that allows general election among the multi-party system, separation of power, or the election to select the supreme leaders, but within this constraint of the authoritarian system, the Chinese government was willing to open space for people to express their grievances or policy recommendations. And then the policies to make that happen is to allow rule of law, legal reform, and village election and administrative reform. So by doing so, as long as they do not claim that the party should be gone, the party should be replaced with a multi-party system, as long as Chinese people do not claim that, they have this opportunity to raise their voices. So that's how the Chinese government introduced the governance reform. And those reform programs happen to coincide with Western organizations try to promote. One example is rule of law. Now, let me start with the village election. So the party allowed village election in the countryside. So any local residents, they can do political campaign, and local residents, they democratically elect their leaders. And then there were many Western organizations like Carter Center or International Republican Institute, which is an association with the Republican Party in the US, and also many European organizations. They invest a lot of resources and time to support this village election in China. They were invited by the Chinese local governments. They observed the village election. They share the idea how to improve the village election. So there was a great deal of cooperation between Western organizations and then Chinese government officials to develop village election. So it is a progress in terms of the electoral system in China. And then we can say that the Western democracy promotion programs serve to enhance China's democratic system at that level. The problem is that there was a limit. So the Western government, Western organizations, after seeing the success of the village election, they proposed that now you can open election for the township government and also the provincial government. So Western organizations, they proposed to elevate the electoral system to the higher level, and then in the end, maybe electing the national leaders. But that was the point that the Chinese government say, well, that was enough. That's not the place that we want to develop much. So the conclusion is that there was some space where Chinese government can work with Western organizations to promote democracy within China, but they have a different thought. Communist Party think that through these policies of liberalization, not really democratization, they believe that they can strengthen the party's legitimacy. And then Western organizations thought that once we start this process, then it will have its own momentum that will lead to eventual democratization of the entire country. But again, the party has the authority to stop that. So now it's stopped.
Interesting. So let me just quickly zoom out and try to, kind of think on implications of this, Chinese style of Chinese definition of democracy on, I want to say world, but, I would kind of try to limit on Asia. So how would you define or how would you characterize effect of China's style of political system on Asia?
So for many Asian countries, they once look at the Western liberal democracy, Western liberal democratic system as an ideal in the past. So every country, they adopted national election and separation of power and multi-party system. Although there is a degree of difference about how governments also guarantees freedom of expression or freedom of media. But they all agree that Western liberal democratic system institutions may be something that they all want to emulate. Even North Koreans, they have a pretense of national election. And alternatively, the China model suggests that without multi-party system or separation of power, maybe the government can really enhance the quality of people's lives if the government functions well, and then if the government comes up with right policy. So there is a two model that Asian countries can look at, and my own opinion is that China model although it looks efficient at the beginning, but because it does not allow the competition of different ideas and criticism, it often in the end fails. And when it fails, it fails very big. And I'm afraid that this Shanghai lockdown can be one example. Or there are many concerns about economic slowdown, if not collapse, because of all the structural problems of Chinese economy, or any political chaos like Cultural Revolution or Great Leap Forward in the past. So although Chinese political system or Chinese democracy looks orderly and then it looks stable, but there is a great danger of big policy failure. But that does not give a free ticket for Western liberal democracy to be the example of right system for Asian countries. So although Chinese system cannot be an alternative to Western liberal democracy, but still it suggests a very good critical point for the Western liberal democracy. So Western liberal democracy guarantees the fair and then transparent procedure of policy making and election. But at the same time, it is polarizing society in this 21st century disinformation age. And also the Western liberal democracy is not really powerful to control the destructive power of capitalism. So when the capitalist economy, market economy is developing fast, in the past, the democratic system can still work to distribute the wealth fairly because the whole economy was growing fast. But developed countries, their economies slow down already for a long time, and then there is a widening gap between the rich and the poor people. And then that widening economic gap starts to distort the political procedure in democratic system, which was supposed to be fair and transparent. And also, so how to deal with this negative impact from capitalism and also the polarization that is caused by all the information technology development. So there is a big homework for the Western liberal democracy. So to summarize, Chinese model cannot be an alternative for Western liberal democracy, but the China model suggests in many points that Western liberal democracy should pay more attention to resolve.
So yeah, that is it. And thank you so much. So in today's episode, we tried to define or tried to look into how China's democracy works and how did they define it, or whether they view it, and whether it can be called a democracy strictly in Western liberal sense. Then we also tried to look into the internal and external factors that affect workings of China's democracy and some considerations from the point of view of Chinese leaders. And then we tried to see if Quad is a factor in this calculations. And lastly, we looked into implications of Chinese style of democracy on Asia and world in large. Thank you so much, Dr. Cho, for joining us today. And please, I would like you to, visit us soon and do listen to this episode.
Great. Thanks for having me.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Dugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.